Starmer's Egypt Summit, Britain's role in Gaza's fragile peace. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We're cutting through the diplomatic theatrics to bring you what's actually happening in British politics. Hit that button, because what I'm about to tell you is something Westminster doesn't want you thinking too hard about. Right? Let's talk about Keir Starmer jetting off to Sharm el-Sheikh. Not for a holiday. Mind you, though the optics of a British Prime Minister heading to an Egyptian resort town while his domestic agenda crumbles might suggest otherwise. No, Starmer's there for something far more consequential, something that could define Britain's foreign policy posture for years to come, and yet something is approaching with all the strategic ambition of a middle manager attending a mandatory conference. The summit in Egypt is meant to cement a peace plan for Gaza, a ceasefire that took effect just days ago after months of catastrophic violence, and our Prime Minister is apparently planning to spend his time there paying particular tribute to Donald Trump. Let that sink in for a moment. Particular tribute to Trump. Now, before we dissect the sheer diplomatic contortion required to make that sentence palatable, let's understand what's actually at stake here. The ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas represents the first genuine pause in hostilities since October 2023, when Hamas-led attacks on southern Israel killed approximately 1,200 people and resulted in 251 hostages being taken. What followed was a military response from Israel that has, according to the Hamas-run health ministry, killed more than 67,000 Palestinians, including over 18,000 children. Those numbers are staggering, almost incomprehensible in their scale, and they form the backdrop to the summit that Starmer is attending with what appears to be more concern for diplomatic niceties and moral clarity. The ceasefire deal itself is fragile, a three-phase arrangement brokered primarily by Trump's administration, working alongside Egyptian and Qatari mediators. Phase 1, which began on Friday morning, requires Hamas to release all Israeli hostages by Monday at noon local time. That's 20 believed to be alive and the remains of up to 28 deceased hostages. In return, Israel is meant to release around 250 Palestinian prisoners and 1,700 detainees from Gaza, while allowing increased humanitarian aid into the Strip. The Israeli military claims it has partially withdrawn troops from parts of Gaza, though it still occupies half the territory, which tells you everything you need to know about how tentative this peace actually is. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply revealing about Britain's current place on the world stage. Starmer is traveling to the summit, a gathering of more than 20 world leaders, to essentially play cheerleader for Trump while the UK itself has already ruled out sending British troops as part of any multinational monitoring force. The Americans are deploying up to 200 troops to what they are calling a civil military coordination center in Israel, alongside forces from Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey. Britain's contribution? Downing Street says we'll host our own three-day summit starting Monday to discuss Gaza's recovery and reconstruction, because apparently what the Middle East really needs right now is another talking shop in London with representatives from Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Germany, and the Palestinian Authority. Foreign Secretary Yvette Cooper, and yes, that's a title now, not Home Secretary as she was under the previous government, helpfully explained on Friday that the UK will continue supporting the peace process in other ways, including looking at getting private finance into Gaza. Private finance into Gaza, a territory that has been systematically destroyed, where infrastructure has been obliterated, where tens of thousands are dead, where a humanitarian catastrophe of unimaginable proportions has unfolded, and Britain's grand contribution is to explore private investment opportunities. It's the kind of neoliberal solution that would be laughable if it weren't so grimly on brand for a Labour government that seems to have forgotten what Labour actually stands for. Let's be brutally honest about what's happening here. Trump, whatever one thinks of his methods or his motives, has inserted himself directly into Middle Eastern diplomacy and brokered a ceasefire that his predecessor failed to achieve. The summit in Sharm el-Sheikh is being co-led by Trump and Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, positioning America firmly at the center of any future arrangements to Gaza. Britain, meanwhile, is showing up to applaud from the sidelines. Starmer's plan to pay particular tribute to Trump isn't just diplomatic protocol. It's a tacit acknowledgement that Britain no longer has the influence or the will to be a primary actor in these negotiations. We're spectators now, dressed up in the language of partnership and cooperation, but fundamentally irrelevant to the actual mechanisms of peace. This matters because it reflects a broader pattern in Starmer's foreign policy, or perhaps more accurately, his lack of one. Since taking office, He's been reactive rather than proactive, cautious to the point of invisibility on the international stage. The Gaza crisis has raged for over a year, and Britain's response has been a masterclass in saying much while doing little. We've called for ceasefires, expressed concern, made statements about international law, and yet when the moment comes to actually contribute to a monitoring force, to put British credibility and British resources on the line, we demur. No plans for troops, Downing Street says, as though the idea had never seriously been considered. Now, some will argue that Britain shouldn't be deploying troops to another Middle Eastern conflict zone, that we've learned our lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan, that our military is overstretched and our priorities should be closer to home. Those are legitimate arguments, but they don't explain why Britain couldn't take a diplomatic lead, why we couldn't have been at the forefront of these negotiations, why our Prime Minister is essentially attending someone else's summit to offer congratulations rather than leadership. The hard truth is that post-Brexit Britain, despite all the rhetoric about global Britain and taking our place on the world stage, has diminished influence and diminished ambition. The details of the ceasefire deal also expose how precarious this entire arrangement is. Phases 2 and 3, which would follow if Phase 1 succeeds, are meant to address the truly thorny issues: the governance of Gaza, the extent of Israeli troop withdrawal, the disarming of Hamas. These are the questions that have bedeviled Middle Eastern peace efforts for decades, and there's nothing in the current agreement that suggests they'll be any easier to resolve now. In fact, a previous ceasefire that began in January collapsed after just 2 months when Israel resumed its military offensive, having never progressed beyond the first stage. History, as they say, doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes, distinctly ominous, and the rhythm here sounds. For Starmer, this summit is a chance to look statesmanlike, to be photographed alongside world leaders, to project an image of Britain engaged in serious international diplomacy. But look beneath the surface and you'll see a strategy that's all optics and no substance. Hosting a 3-day summit in London about Gaza's reconstruction while the ceasefire is still in its first fragile hours is putting the cart several miles ahead of the horse. It's a political equivalent of planning the renovation before you've put out the fire. Yes, reconstruction will be necessary. Yes, discussions about governance and finance will be crucial. But doing it now, while the Israeli military still occupies half of Gaza, while the terms of Phases 2 and 3 remain entirely unresolved, smacks of a government more interested in appearing relevant than actually being relevant. And then there's the Trump factor. Starmer paying particular tribute to Trump at this summit is a choice, and choices in diplomacy are never accidental. It signals that Britain is willing to subordinate itself to American priorities, that we'll praise Trump's deal-making even if it means overlooking the deeper structural issues that make this conflict so intractable. Trump's approach to Middle Eastern diplomacy has always been transactional, focused on deals rather than principles, and by aligning ourselves so closely with that approach, Britain is essentially admitting that we no longer have a distinctive foreign policy voice. We're echoing America's positions rather than advancing our own. What makes this particularly galling is that Britain actually does have deep historical ties to this region, for better or worse, and we could theoretically play a constructive role in these negotiations. Instead, we're choosing to be deferential, to follow rather than lead, to host side conferences rather than shape the main event. It's a foreign policy of managed decline, dressed up in the language of partnership and cooperation. The human cost of all this diplomatic maneuvering is almost too immense to comprehend. More than 67,000 Palestinians dead, over 18,000 of them children. Families torn apart, communities destroyed, an entire generation traumatized. On the Israeli side, the horror of October 7th and the ongoing anguish of hostages still held by Hamas. These aren't abstract numbers or talking points for summit discussions. They are real people whose lives have been shattered by this conflict. And yet the tone from Downing Street has been relentlessly technocratic, focused on mechanisms and processes rather than the moral urgency of ending this catastrophe. Starmer's journey to Egypt encapsulates everything that's simultaneously sensible and deeply frustrating about his approach to governance. He's there because Britain should be there, because we can't simply absent ourselves from major international diplomatic efforts. But he's there without a clear strategy, without apparent leverage, and seemingly without the ambition to do anything more than show up and applaud others. It's a foreign policy equivalent of his domestic agenda, cautious, managerial, desperately afraid of making waves or taking risks. The question for those of us watching British politics is what kind of country we want to be on the world stage. Do we want to be deal makers and peace brokers, nations that punch above our weight through diplomatic skill and moral authority? Or are we content to be a medium-sized power that attends summits, hosts conferences, and issues statements while the real decisions are made elsewhere? Because right now, we're very much in the latter category, and Starmer's trip to Egypt is just the latest confirmation of that reality. When Starmer returns from Sharm el-Sheikh, no doubt he'll brief Parliament on the summit's outcomes, on Britain's contribution to peace efforts, on the importance of our ongoing engagement with Middle Eastern partners. It will all sound terribly serious and responsible. But the underlying truth will remain. Britain was a spectator at this summit, not a protagonist. We cheered for Trump's deal rather than crafting our own. We promised reconstruction conferences while declining to contribute to monitoring forces. We talked about private finance solutions to what is fundamentally a political and humanitarian crisis. There's a brittleness to the ceasefire that everyone involved understands, but few want to acknowledge publicly. The January ceasefire collapsed after 2 months. Phase 1 of this current deal requires Hamas to release hostages and Israel to release prisoners and allow aid, but phases 2 and 3, where the real work happens, remain entirely unresolved. The governance of Gaza, the withdrawal of Israeli troops, the disarming of Hamas, these aren't technical details to be worked out later. They're existential questions that go to the heart of the conflict. And there's no indication that either side has fundamentally changed its position on these issues. Israel's stated goal remains the elimination of Hamas as a military threat. Hamas's stated goal remains resistance to occupation. Those positions aren't easily reconciled, and a temporary ceasefire doesn't resolve them. So Starmer stands in Sharm el-Sheikh, preparing to pay tribute to Trump, while British influence continues its long, slow fade. It's not dramatic. It's not a crisis. It's just the quiet reality of a nation that's chosen management over leadership, caution over vision. And perhaps that's what the British electorate wanted when they voted Labour into power. Perhaps after years of Boris Johnson's bluster and Liz Truss's chaos and Rishi Sunak's ineffectiveness, competent mediocrity feels like a relief. But competent mediocrity doesn't build peace in the Middle East. It doesn't give Britain a meaningful role in shaping global events. It just ensures we're in the room when history happens, taking notes rather than writing the story. Make sure you subscribe because we're going to keep tracking how Britain navigates these international waters, how Starmer's foreign policy evolves or doesn't, and what it means for our place in a world that's increasingly dangerous and increasingly indifferent to British sensibilities. This story is far from over, and neither are we.